Recently, I've come under fire a little bit for calling myself a balance trainer, which kind of blew my mind because to me, balance really is the approach everywhere in my life. I'm trying not to be an extremist at anything. I'm trying to consider all of the variables and do the one that is appropriate at the time, in the moment, and will get the outcome that I want. And of course, in dog training, the experience of the dog is included in the outcome that I want. So today, I want to just explain to you that balanced dog training is actually the thoughtful, the intentional, and the skilled application of what we sometimes hear referred to as the matrix of motivation or operant conditioning, where we have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. We have positive punishment and negative punishment. But today, let's not get too out of control. Let's not upset too many people. Let's just talk about this reinforcement piece. Let's just expand on that and understand why we might want to use positive reinforcement in conjunction with negative reinforcement to create balance and give the dog a complete understanding of what it is we're trying to teach it. So let's jump straight into it today and first of all acknowledge that these are actually really big topics. There's a lot more to this than I could possibly explain to you in one short video. But when we're going to talk about positive reinforcement, what we really mean by positive reinforcement is the application. Our plus symbol here is about adding rather than necessarily being good. It means to give the dog something that increases the frequency and likelihood of our target behavior. Of course, then we have negative reinforcement. Now, negative reinforcement means to remove something. Think of that as a minus symbol, a takeaway, because we are going to remove some form of discomfort or annoyance, or at its most extreme, it could be aversive style pain compliance that is going to increase the frequency and likelihood of a behavior. Now, there are absolutely plenty of reasons why we want to create a balanced training approach that has a really strong understanding of the pros and cons of positive reinforcement, as well as the pros and cons of negative reinforcement. Let's start with positive reinforcement. Training with positive reinforcement can be a really complex thing. But for the sake of this video, let's just break that into two kinds of ways we could do that. One being training with food and one being training with toys. Now, training with food. Everybody loves to do it. It's a really easy way to interact with the dog. It reduces conflict because you don't have to get anything back from the dog. You don't need an out or anything like that, like you do when you get a training toys. And there are a heap of pros and cons in training with food. The biggest pro of all positive reinforcement as we use it is that it is motivational. When we're training with food or toys, what we're saying to the dog is, if you figure out the behavior, you will receive a paycheck for it. The problem, the con of training with positive reinforcement is that it increases the frequency and the likelihood of something that has already happened. So if while we're training with the dog chooses not to do the thing, we cannot positively reinforce it. Of course we can, but we can't compel the dog to do the thing in that moment. And of course, there are times when we absolutely must compel a dog to do the thing that we need it to do. And there's lots of reasons for that. The dog's safety, people's safety, as well as the actual function of the dog. Like the dog might have a job that it needs to do at a particular time. So talking about food, let's get into it. When we're training with food, we have the ability to reward the dog in position and have the dog keep on going, doing what it's doing. The reason we would do that is because we want to give that reward in place and continue the frequency of the behavior while it is happening. We want to tell to the dog, hey, I like what you're doing, keep going, keep doing it. By doing that, we're going to put a lot of weight into the behavior. We're going to put a lot of draw into the behavior. But one of the traps of doing too much of this is that it can slow a dog down, as well as in our learning phase, if we're rewarding in position a lot, it gives the dog a good understanding of what the position is, but it doesn't necessarily help the dog find the position. And as we get into more complex things, that can be part of the challenge challenge in what we're training is having the dog actually get into the position. So the huge pro of rewarding a dog in position is that it gives a dog a solid understanding of what it's doing is correct. It builds stability and confidence in that position, but it can slow the dog down a bit as the dog moves, and it doesn't necessarily help the dog find the position. Our next way of using food is to reward the dog terminally in position. And what do we mean by that? We mean that we give some kind of marker, a word, a sound, a gesture, whatever it is, that tells to the dog, I like what you're doing. You no longer have to do it, but I'm going to give you this reward, this positive reinforcement, this food right here in front of you so that it maintains that position. You understand that you got that for being in the position, but I want you to move out of the position. And when we do that, we are overcoming that con that we talked about, which is that the dog then moves out of the position and then has to re-find the position. It gets the dog moving a little bit, and we know that movement begets movement, and as we get the dog to come out of the position, we reinforced, hey, I came to you, there's no need to get off the position, I come to you and I give you that payment in place, but now that you've had that payment in place, you no longer have to do the behavior. Now that has to have some kind of mark that tells the dog you're finished doing what you're doing, and that looks like a clicker or a yes marker or something like that. Our next one, reinforcer out of the position, terminally to the handler. So what does that look like? That tells us that while the dog is doing the target behavior, we as a handler can then mark it, which is, our word, our sound, our action, whatever it is, that tells the dog what you're doing was correct. You no longer need to be doing it anymore. I want you to come to me and take the reinforcer. And we give the dog the reinforcer, the food in that moment. I like this one a lot because causing that terminal movement out of the behavior creates a dog that does the behavior with much more anticipation to leave it, and therefore a little bit more powerfully. Of course, that pro can act as a strong con for us because now we've got a dog that's a little bit less stable in the position. And if the dog is likely to think, well, I'm going to take my reinforcer by myself, or he wants to prompt us to give the reinforcer, his best bet at doing that is to leave the position. And so it can cost us a little bit of stability in that way. The other way that we can then train with food is to train terminally, again, where we say to the dog, the behavior that you're doing is finished, you no longer need to be doing it, and go and get the food that is elsewhere. And in order to do that, we might do that with something like a manners minder, which I really love to train with. And if you don't have one of those, you need the impulse control in the dog to be able to maintain the behavior while we put food onto the floor. And of course, then we have a marker that tells the dog, you can go get that thing. You're finished doing what you're doing there, you can go get it. Now, what you'll see is just training with nothing but positive reinforcement using food. I'm just going to drag you out of this video for a sec. I want to explain something. So in the dog space, videos like this, learning little tidbits of information are really cool, but it is just like one floating piece of information. And what I kind of observe is people get really wrapped around the axles in these one little pieces. So what I have, and as I said to you in this video, like this is just like a summary, a piece. There's so much more you can know. What I have is this online course that develops the information within your mind, something like this, right? It's a structure where up here we have this first layer of learning, and I call that my overview. It's a 1-hour video. You can jump in the link in the description. You'll be able to watch that right now and give you an understanding of all things dog training, kind of a top-down view of the whole thing. Then into here, my course then has this part that we call the wave tops, which sort of is a series of stories and explanations. Some are funny, some are sad, but they all carry a point and will explain to you the headings that we hit when we go into the overview here. And finally, we go into this section that I call the deep dives. Now, the deep dives is like everything that I know. It's so much information and then all the practical demonstrations. And then we break off of this when we know all this stuff, and we have like my decoy course, and we have here my handler specific course, and we have here my high drive puppy course. And the truth is, because my course is literally called Everything Pat Knows, anything that I get really good at, we put it into the course. There's coaching and all kinds of things available. So enjoy this video, but if you really want to understand dog training, if you really want to get good at this stuff, jump into that link in the description. There's an amazing course there you can check out. All right, let's get back to it. We have a really cool way to say to the dog, hey, I like what you're doing. keep doing it. I like that you're doing that. Here's food in position. And we can say to the dog, hey, I like what you're doing. You no longer need to be doing that. And there's 3 ways that we can burst the dog out of that position. We can go all the way over to them and pay them in position if we want more stability in there, but we could pay them to us and we could pay them externally. All 3 of those types of reinforcer that are terminal give the dog an understanding of where the reinforcer might come from, and in doing that will create draw. While we're watching the dog, we're going to be looking and determining, is the dog anticipating? Is the dog nice and stable in the position? Or is the dog too loose in the position? Does the position need to be tightened up? All of those would determine which way we then reinforce the dog next. Let's talk about how you would do this with toys and play. I love training with food. It's really easy. Each rep is very fast. But the reality is the turbo gets attached to your dog's engagement and to their likelihood of working for long periods of time without reinforcement once we bring in the toys and the games. So I'm not saying don't train with food. I love food in order to create balance. Often food is a great place to start because of how many reps we can get going, how quickly we can give the dog the understanding of what we're trying to teach it, and how easy it is for us to actually physically do it. Once we go to toys, now we're into a position where we're going to likely bring up a higher state of arousal from the dog. We're going to have to move ourselves physically a lot more. It's much more difficult, but we are going to get way more buy-in from a dog. And typically what we see is that a dog who is trained with food will have less ability to work for long durations without reinforcement. We can usually link together less behaviors than we can when we start to train with toys. Dogs that are continually trained with toys, not necessarily taught the behavior, but trained with the toys, are likely to be able to sequence together much longer sequences of behaviors without reinforcement, i.e. without being given the toy. So that's again how we're going to create a form of balance, is by considering which form of reinforcer we're going to use when it's time to use one. Now, when we're training with toys, we have to consider that we lose one of those things that we can do with food, because it's really difficult, bordering impossible, to reward a dog in position with a toy and tell it to keep going, because it has to terminate the position in order to actually play with the toy. So when we're playing with toys, we have the option to pay the dog terminally in position. And what that means is that we usually will bring the toy right over to the dog and pay it right in front of its face so that it begins the game right where it is rather than it coming to us. Now, the reason we would do that is, again, to create more stability in the behavior. But just like with food, this gives us the opportunity to really control the way that the dog finishes doing the behavior, because that moment where we give the mark and let the dog actually get the thing, that's the most reinforced moment, that very moment right before we give it. And if we have a dog who's really hunched forward or is beginning to have its behavior deteriorate in anticipation of leaving the behavior, terminally marking the behavior, as in telling the dog, you no longer need to do it, take your reinforcer, but placing the reinforcer in a way that improves the behavior will help create balance. It'll help us build a level of understanding of the behavior that we actually want, and the dog will be able to, or be more likely to, do that behavior next time. Now, of course, when we're talking about training with toys, we can do the same in that we can terminally mark out of the behavior and the dog come to us and take the reinforcer. Take the ball, play with the ball, we could throw it, whatever it is. Again, the same pros and cons exist as when we're training with food, in that is going to create a really active dog, a dog who enjoys movement and is happy to search for behaviors, but it is likely to degrade a little bit the stability of the behaviors. And it can not only degrade the stability of the behavior in that the dog might want to move out of the behavior in order to take its own reinforcer, the position of the dog in the behavior can change significantly if it's anticipating the release from that behavior rather than locking into it or anticipating being rewarded in place or another behavior coming from there. So that rewards out of position create that movement but can degrade the behavior. Just like with food, but in this case it's much easier, we can also reward a dog out of the position and away from the handler. Now, why would we want to do that? This is going to help create balance in the behaviors. Sometimes, and to some people, it's important even which way the dog anticipates its release from the behavior, and we might not want the dog anticipating a release towards the handler. This is especially important in things like detection training, where we might throw a toy over the head of the dog so that from the dog's point of view, it comes from behind him and forward, giving him no reason to want to look back to the handler in anticipation of the reward for having had the find. So, understanding that we can reward in position terminally with a toy, out of position to us terminally with a toy, as well as out of position to a toy that's somewhere else, we would want to keep markers and the ability to do all of that in order to create balance. Just using positive reinforcement, we can help stabilize a dog in that positions. But here's the thing. So far, all we've done is tell the dog, you are right currently, or you were right, come take your reinforcer. Negative reinforcement gives us the ability to tell the dog, you are not right yet, or that is not correct yet, get back into the position. So negative reinforcement, we can do that with many tools, and today for the demonstration, I'm going to be doing it with a prong collar. The main use of negative reinforcement is to the position. And this is where we're going to jiggle the collar, apply a form of pressure that will lead the dog to want to find the behavior that will stop that pressure. In this way, we call it escape training, because we apply the pressure, and when the dog does the behavior that we've asked, we turn off that pressure, and in the dog's mind, it's a terrible word, but it's the correct word that we're left with via the science, is that he has escaped the pressure. By stopping the pressure at the moment that the dog does the correct behavior, we are in that moment telling the dog, hey, that's the thing that I want you to do. In future, when there's a marker or a command or a signal that predicts the pressure, the dog then sees the signal, predicts that the pressure is going to come, and in that moment chooses to avoid it and does the behavior. Now, this is how dogs have been trained for centuries, maybe thousands of years, in that dogs really, really clearly understand pressure and release for guiding them towards target behaviors. They understand it fully. But there are some pros and cons to doing this. And one of the cons is that if we're too heavy-handed, we can cause a dog a pretty significantly aversive experience, so we need to avoid that. And similarly, one of the things that can come of this is that a dog can get a little bit trapped in the behavior. A dog might think, yep, okay, like I definitely want to escape and avoid that pressure, so I'll do the behavior. But then the dog can be difficult to convince to come out of that behavior or to finish that behavior sometimes if the learning of it has been a little bit too aversive. The biggest pro of escape and avoidance training is that in the learning phase, the dog believes that it has escaped the pressure, but in the use of this, as the dog understands it, and when we go to our variable stages of reinforcement and we build more complex parts of the behavior, the dog then in that moment not only believes that he has escaped the pressure, but that he's avoiding it. So even in the times where we have no intention to use negative reinforcement, in the dog's mind, he is avoiding it and is therefore reinforced. So that's why we often find that behaviors taught with negative reinforcement are far less prone to extinction than behaviors taught with positive reinforcement. As in, the dog's understanding of what we want and their willingness to do it lasts much longer. But the reinforcement aspect of it, that the dog is reinforced, that the dog feels good about having done the behavior, remains, despite us not intending to actually apply the pressure. So, we have our negative reinforcement to the position. By doing that, we can create something of an activation pop. And this is one of the things that sometimes really upsets people because it can be super hard to understand, but I want to explain it to you in a way that made it super clear to me And when my mentor explained this to me, I was like, oh, I get it. I totally understand. And I changed my way of training and actually use this. Is that you imagine that there is a soccer player ready to sub onto the field and he's not allowed to cross the line until the other player comes on. What we very often see is the coach stands there with his hand on that player's shoulder. That player is absolutely going to play the game. His positive reinforcement is coming from his payment and his internal, intrinsic desire to play the game. And yet, as the other player crosses the line, what we very often see is the coach tap him on the shoulder and off he goes. That is what we talk about when we say the activation tap of negative reinforcement. It's the pop that accompanies the command. It's that reminder of off you go powerfully to do the thing. And we do that every now and again in order to remind the dog, this is what you're avoiding. And it's not a version that is going to cause any form of distress, any real form of discomfort. In fact, it will bring the dog up and remind the dog of powerfully doing the behavior. So by using negative reinforcement to the position, that then gives us the ability to give the pop, the tap that acts as a reinforcer of the command, and we can give that to the position just as a tap when the dog already knows it, and have that act as a reinforcer, something that makes it more likely for the dog to do it and increases the dog's arousal, gives that dog that good feeling of yeah, I know what I'm doing, off I go to do it. This is the next thing of negative reinforcement that kind of blows people's minds, is negative reinforcement can be used to stabilize a behavior as well. Now think about it in terms like this. Everybody has done this, whether they realize it or not. When you've got a dog in a static duration behavior and you are going to pat that dog in that position, everybody intrinsically knows that you need to give a slow, continuous pat so that the dog feels it in that position and maybe even resists against it a little bit, and then the stopping of the patting reinforces the dog in that position. We know that if you've got a dog in a static duration behavior and you give something that looks like a tickle, something that looks like that activation tap that we were talking about, that's likely to burst the dog out of the behavior. That's not more likely to keep the dog in the behavior, it bursts it out. So what we know is that we can use negative reinforcement as a way of telling the dog to keep on going even when it is doing the behavior. And we do that via applying a little bit of pressure that comes at a time when the dog has a good understanding of what the behavior is. The dog then interprets that pulling out of the position as a trap and resists against it. The dog says, no, I'm not moving, and resists against that little bit of pressure. And in that moment, he gives the strongest, most flexed, most powerful version of the behavior. It's him committing to the behavior, not being able to be changed out of it. And the release of the pressure at that moment tells the dog, hey, that was correct. You're on the right track. You're doing the right thing. Because as we know, with negative reinforcement, it's the release of the pressure that educates the dog. What we usually end up saying is that the pressure motivates and the release educates. Why would we want to use negative reinforcement at all if positive reinforcement gets the job done? Positive reinforcement doesn't always get the job done. That's the reality of it. But here's the thing, here's the most important part, and this is why I am and will remain a balanced trainer for all time, unless somebody convinces me otherwise, but you'll have to counter this point. In that with positive reinforcement, when we've taught a dog to do something and the dog has only known positive reinforcement in position, out of position, food, toys, whatever it is you want, if that's all the dog has known, positive reinforcement will eventually at some point fail. That's part of training. We need to be pushing to the point where our training falls apart a little bit so that we can correct it and continue going. We don't want to always be successful. That's not how we learn. We know that, to get into the flow state, to hit that proper learning environment, we really only want to be about 80% successful. So 8 out of 10 times when I tell the dog to do something, I expect that the dog will highly likely do it, and I can reinforce positively in all the many and various ways that we've discussed. But in order to be progressing my training, in order to be actually making it more likely that my dog does these things under more difficult conditions, ultimately leading to what it will need to do in the real world and the most extreme version of what it will need to do in the real world, because I don't want to fail at a time when I really need the dog to do the behavior, is I'm going to be pushing. So those 2 out of 10 times that the dog doesn't do the thing, it's because it's externally motivated, it's distracted, given the context of what's going on, it doesn't fully understand. in that moment, I can help the dog understand the behavior with negative reinforcement. And my goal, the real reason why I want to be able to use negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement in all of their many and various terms, is that I love the idea of giving the dog this understanding that negative reinforcement drives the dog into the behavior. And when I stop using negative reinforcement as the dog understands the behavior, he knows this is where I'm correct, and then I can reinforce that for him with my positive reinforcement. So the way I personally love to train is to use negative reinforcement to drive a dog into the behavior and positive reinforcement to pull the dog out of the behavior. Negative reinforcement comes up to the target and we say to the dog, yes, that's it, right there, you're correct. And if I want to reinforce in position with negative reinforcement, I can. And there might be reasons, pros and cons as to why I would use negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement, but I absolutely can use that there as well. I want to reinforce in position, have the dog understand this is the target behavior, this is what I want you to do, and then I can mark terminally and bring the dog out of the position with my positive reinforcement. Therefore, creating something of like a sandwich of my target behavior, giving absolute clarity to my dog about what it is I want him to do and when I want him to do it. There's two more things that make me want to train this way for the rest of my life. The next is that if my dog straight up says, no, I'm not doing it, and there are times where dogs will say and do that despite them knowing full well what it is, in that moment, if I need to have the dog do that, I can compel the dog with negative reinforcement in that moment. And then my negative reinforcement becomes a correction. With the pressure that the dog came to understand in its learning phases, I can compel the dog and say, no, you must. Where I see a lot of people who don't want to train in this way, where they go wrong is that they train entirely with positive reinforcement, which is cool. Everything looks great, everything's fine. But then for whatever reason, one day the dog decides not to do it. And then those people, because of their own frustrations, their own, whatever, decide to use the pressure to correct the dog in that moment. And it doesn't work. And then they'll report, well, it doesn't work. I've seen it. They never admit to doing it themselves. I've seen someone else do it and it wrecked the dog. Looks just like my dog. But the reason that doesn't work is because there's been no learning phase of negative reinforcement. A pressure that's applied in that moment is out of context. The dog doesn't understand what it is. And it probably is right to say at that point, you're just abusing the dog because you're not giving the dog any level of understanding. Negative reinforcement, in order to be used as a correction, has to have had a learning phase where it's taught the behavior, where the dog has come to understand, I turn off this pressure via doing the behavior. And then later, when we ask the dog to do it, and the dog says, no, I'm not doing it, we can apply the pressure, and the dog goes, yeah, okay, I know how to turn that pressure off via doing the behavior. So, the whole point of training with positive reinforcement and with negative reinforcement is to create balance. I'm going to use the amount of the one and in the way that is going to get me the outcome that I want. And the outcome that I want always, regardless of the target behavior that I'm teaching, always involves the positive experience of the dog. But I look at that positive experience of the dog holistically. I don't look at it in micro moments, because there are micro moments where my dog is experiencing aversive consequences that give him the understanding not to do that thing again, or to avoid that consequence, right? To avoid that situation, to get to the thing with when it's told, or whatever it is. Giving the dog that feedback creates the clarity where I can show the dog what I think is the clearest level of understanding I can, where it's negative reinforcement into the behavior and then positive reinforcement out of the behavior. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be using negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement in equal measures. That is not what balance is. Balance is using whichever one is necessary at that moment for that dog, given the level of understanding that we are trying to impart to the dog in that moment. That's what balance training is, approaching it purely from the lens of reinforcement only. In this video, you've seen me teaching a dog to jump onto a bed and to sit there. You can apply these principles to absolutely any target behavior that you like. If you want to learn more about balance training from me, there's a link on your screen that you can click. That'll take you to my website, and there is a huge amount of information there. You can jump into the free section of my online course and learn a ton of stuff. But when you're ready to take dog training really seriously, when you're ready to actually understand how to do this stuff and how to control the mind and dog of a body in a way that makes you feel really good and in a way that gets amazing results, and that always includes the experience of the dog, jump into that course. I promise you, you'll love it. There's probably another video on the screen you could check out as well. See ya.